Everyone knows the Imperial Star Destroyer. Of all the ships produced in the history of the galaxy, the ISD is most iconic. Imperial Star Destroyers are standardized and all the more fearsome for it. There are multiple standards, in fact, the Imperial 1 and Imperial 2. However, these are not the first Star Destroyers. We'll ignore the precursors from KOTOR and SWTOR. Right now, we're interested in the Clone Wars lineage. At the start of the Clone Wars, there was only the Acclamator class. They have a familiar shape, but are not true Star Destroyers. Rather, these are transport ships for the Republic's Grand Army. Their purpose was to handle every aspect of clone trooper deployment. Acclamators can launch from a planet, so surface-to-orbit passenger shuttles can be eliminated. There is no need for a tanker in the convoy to resupply while crossing the galaxy. Escort ships aren't essential either, an Acclamator is well armed. Finally, each Acclamator is its own landing craft. This removes countless tons of support vessels from the logistics chain. I'd argue Acclamators are the best military transport ships the galaxy has ever seen. They can carry 16,000 clone troopers and 164 large vehicles. The size makes an Acclamator one of the largest warships in the Republic. For comparison, we'll look at the previous standard. In the Old Republic Navy, they had Dreadnought heavy cruisers. Rendirli Stardrive created a 600-meter metal Titan. Decades later, Rothana Heavy Engineering would respond. The Acclamator class are 752 meters long and 460 meters wide. Though we don't have other dimensions for the Dreadnought, we can guess. The Acclamator is 200 meters tall, and the Dreadnought will be around that height. That makes the Dreadnought a similar length, yet only half the volume and weight. Other aspects are similar. Both ships carry 16,000 soldiers. For the Dreadnought, this is the crew requirement. The Acclamator carries 16,000 passengers and 700 crewmen. Their engines are extremely different. The Dreadnought is remarkably slow. Sublight drives on the Acclamator give it speed beyond any similar vessel. Faster than Naboo Royal ships, Slave One, and even some starfighters. An Acclamator can reach 3,500 G of acceleration. The Arc 170 can only manage 2,600 G, and the Tri-Fighter pulls away at 3,600 G. For a capital ship, that is incredible. Hyperdrives are a similar story. Dreadnoughts are slow here as well, with only a Class 2 hyperdrive. Anything faster than X3 is still a reasonable military speed. The B-Wing and Imperial 1 have that X2 grade as well. An Imperial 2 has a standard Class 1, just like the X-Wing. The Millennium Falcon, the fastest ship in the galaxy, has a Class 0.5 hyperdrive. Lower is better, so anything below 1 is legendary.
She'll make 0.5 past light speed.
A customized chip trying to match Han's speed. Well, it might be able to reach Class 0.75. As for the Acclamator, it can make 0.6 past light speed.
This is incredible!
What's more, an Acclamator has 25,000 light-years of hyperspace range. Our galaxy is only 100,000 light-years in diameter, and we think that's normal. That means an Acclamator fleet can make a return trip to the opposite side of the galaxy. Weaponry is where the two ships are most similar. The Dreadnought has 20 quad turbo lasers, 10 turbo laser cannons, and 10 turbo laser batteries. This is the main selling point of a Dreadnought, rather than its hull or shields. An Acclamator has 12 quad turbo laser turrets and 24 laser cannons. This makes the landing ship relatively undergunned for its vast size. After all its exceptional features, it's about time the Acclamator had a shortcoming. The design is only a landing ship, not meant to win naval battles on its own. All those laser cannons are intended to support the ground forces. In order to punch above its weight, the Acclamator has one other weapon. A set of launch tubes for large missiles and proton torpedoes. All 4 tubes will be considerably larger than starfighter torpedoes. It was always clear that there must have been a proto-Star Destroyer. The Acclamator is a perfect first step in the lineage. In the year 2005, we saw another ancestor of the Star Destroyer, the Venator class, arguably the first true Star Destroyer. Going by the movies alone, we had Acclamator, Venator, Imperial, and Super class. These ships are featured prominently in at least one movie each. They can't be missed. At face value, this is a simple, linear progression. Every new Star Destroyer is longer and stronger than the previous one. Technology gets slightly better as time passes. However, it was never quite that simple. There is another Star Destroyer. The Venator is, in many ways, a potential replacement for the Acclamator. Like the original landing ship, Venator is a hollow transporter. Both ships can carry clone troopers and a great many vehicles. They are both set up for planetary landings, despite their enormous size. Even their heavy torpedo launch tubes are the same. Acclamators were built by Rothana Heavy Engineering. That company is owned by Kuat Drive Yards, who built the Venator class. Kuat would go on to produce the Imperial Star Destroyer. For all their similarities, the Venator does not make a particularly good landing barge. It carries 24 heavy walkers instead of 48. For the LAAT gunships, a Venator holds 40 instead of 80. Worst of all, the troop transport is 2,000 instead of 16,000. To land an army of the same size, you would need 8 Venators to replace a single Acclamator. For small-scale operations like Utapau, a few Venators will do fine. A few Venators will do fine.
No, they won't.
Some kind of high-capacity troop transport is still needed, though. These could either be a Venator modification or the reliable Acclamators. Speaking of minor variants, there had been a gap in the Republic fleet. Acclamators make unbeatable transports and decent warships. That completely leaves out a critical part of any Star Wars battle. A standard Acclamator doesn't carry even one starfighter. Fighter escorts could be hyperspace capable on their own. The X-Wing and Delta 7 Aether Sprite could jump in formation with a clone fleet. That would sharply limit their numbers, so it would be better to bring a carrier. Initially, this would have been a modified Acclamator, perhaps with a couple of squadrons on every ship, replacing some gunships. Alternatively, one ship in 10 could be fully converted to carrier duty. This niche called for a new class of ship. It would have 2 roles, a starfighter carrier and a space battleship. These are the shortcomings of the initial Republic fleet. Since the Clone Wars had officially started, the secrecy of Rothana was over. Future warships could be developed in the open, at Kuat Drive Yards. This is where things start to get complicated, dragging in family drama. The Venator project had competition. Dreadnoughts had been developed before the Clone Wars started, where once they had been top of the line, new classes would render them obsolete. In the age of the Acclamator, nobody wanted to order a new Dreadnought. This was a problem for Rendirli Star Drive. All of a sudden, military sales dried up. To create a new generation of warship, Rendirli approached a ship designer from Kuat. At the time, one of the most advanced vessels in the galaxy was the Aether Sprite. Kuat Systems Engineering had created the Delta 7 Interceptor for the Jedi Order. The Aether Sprite was shaped like a dagger, specifically a Cincadus. A lot of ships have been described as dagger-shaped, but they're usually much larger. The designer of the Delta 7 was named Walex Blissex. After creating an interceptor for KSE, Walex left the company. His new employer would be Rendirli Star Drive. Walex Blissex was asked to create a dreadnought for the Clone Wars era. As we'd expect from a man of his caliber, Walex succeeded. He designed the Victory-class Star Destroyer, the greatest warship in the galaxy. We had always known about this since 1987. The Victory class was the design that came before the Imperial class. Visually, that much is obvious. A VSD looks like a smaller version of an ISD. We always knew that the Victory was created near the end of the Clone Wars. Well, that's where the history of history comes in. 18 Earth years after the Victory was created, its lore was overwritten. The movies got up to the end of the Clone Wars with no Victory in sight.
It ought to be here, but it isn't.
Instead, the Venator was shown as the latest in the Star Destroyer line. In the 2005 cross-sections, the Victory was mentioned as being an older model. That would mean it went Acclamator, Victory, Venator, Imperial. Or rather, the Imperator class would later be renamed to the Imperial. These cross-sections say the Imperator already existed by the war's end. This is unacceptable. For a start, the name Victory was chosen carefully. In both our universe and theirs, the VSD was created to end the Clone Wars. The Old Republic chose the name Victory class with hope and optimism. West End Games made that choice for contrast, to show a very old ship.
It's an older code, sir, but it checks out.
One that had been built for the last war, before the Dark Times, before the Empire. This was a great idea, but the last movie failed to follow up on it. The cross-sections attempted to justify the Venator by making it the latest and greatest ship design. Another confusing detail from that book is the Imperator class. It tells us Venator production slowed in favor of the Imperator. Strictly speaking, this doesn't mean any ISDs had entered service yet. However, it does mean the design was finished and construction was underway. It also mentioned the Tector class, which is virtually indistinguishable from the Imperial. This exists to explain an odd-looking ship from Return of the Jedi. Not a big deal. The Tector is a minor variation from the base Imperial class. This timeline for the ISD contradicts the original lore. Originally, the creation of the Imperial class nearly destroyed the Empire. The design was too large and expensive, might be impossible, and might not be worthwhile. The process started during the reign of the Empire, then it took years before the first ISD was complete. In the 2005 version of events, the Imperator class was only months away. Then, the design wouldn't change until 20 years later, with the Imperial 2. That seems completely implausible to me. Let's continue through the history of history. Apparently, the next major change happened around 2008. I'm informed that in the 3D Clone Wars cartoon, it showed Venators too early. Despite being set a few weeks after the war started, Venators were already in use. In some ways, this is a good thing.
From a certain point of view.
It moves the Venator earlier into the timeline.
A certain point of view?
That leaves the Victory class to enter service at the tail end of the war. The problem is that there's no time for Venators to be designed and built. They would have to have been in the initial Republic order to show up in the early months.
You will be delighted to hear that we are on schedule.
This gives us a good basis, but we can't accept any of it verbatim. To complete the history, we need to look at a book from 2012. The Essential Guide to Warfare mentions the Venator being joined by the Victory. Or rather, it seems to say Victor Class and Victor Initiative Project. I assume at least one of these is a typo, since the book says Victory elsewhere. There is one other detail from this book that I find surprising. It claims Walex Blissix created the Eta 2 Actus interceptor. That doesn't seem possible to me. When the Clone Wars started, Walex cut ties with Kuat Drive Yards and KSE. Officially, the Actus interceptor is made by Kuat Systems Engineering. The only way for Blissix to be involved is for it to be an older design. The cross-sections book implies this, saying the Actus has been around for 3 years. That would make it the same age as the KSE Aether Sprite, which Walex definitely created. No, I don't believe the age, or the designer, or even the manufacturer. Walex will have been working on a new KSE fighter when Imperial Star Drive approached him. This design would be the Alpha 3 Nimbus, largely based on the Delta 7. It would be nicknamed the V-Wing, since the original V-Wing won't be built until decades later. The databank confirms Walex was involved with the Nimbus V-Wing. For some reason, the wiki also says he developed the X-Wing and Y-Wings. I haven't found a source for those claims. They are quite unbelievable. I'd rather assign the Eta 2 interceptor to Cinar, given its similarities. Republic Cinar systems would iterate from the Actus to create the TIE Fighter series. This sorts out the timeline. It keeps Mr. Blissix from being in 2 places at once. He makes a start on the V-Wing, then leaves KSE's engineers to finish the blueprints. At this point, just after the Clone Wars begin, the Republic orders a set of new ships. One contract goes to Kuat Drive Yards, another to Imperial Star Drive. It will take about 2 years for the Imperial order to be fulfilled, near the end of the war. The wait will be worth it. Walex Blissix redefines what it means to be a Star Destroyer. The Victory class is the greatest vessel of its era. Back on Kuat, there was another Blissix still working for KDY. Lyra Blissix is the daughter of Walex and used to work with him. She stayed with Kuat Drive Yards to design the Venator. Since Rathana is owned by KDY, they had access to the Acclimator blueprints. Based on these designs, Lyra Blissix came up with the Venator in record time. I reckon the first Venators will enter service 1 year after war were declared.
Unless, of course, war were declared.
What's that?
War were declared.
Lyra will be very pleased with herself, having created the best general-purpose warship. After another year goes by, the war is almost over, and the Victory class is finished. Instantly, the Venator seems outdated. As usual, Waylex Blissix outshines his daughter. I'm not making this up, by the way. Look at their stats in the West End RPG system. Lyra Blissix has 8D in warship design, so she rolls 8 D6 chance cubes. Waylex Blissix has 10D in that skill, so he rolls 10 of them. Both of these skill values are astonishingly high. Those paying attention will notice that one character sheet has the wrong name. That's because years later, Lyra will get married to an Imperial governor, Den Wessex. Lyra Wessex created the Imperial class, but Lyra Blissix designed the Venator. She is not a very nice woman, to put it mildly. Her father thinks there is still good in her, but he is wrong. Waylex would go on to work for the rebellion, creating the A-Wing. Let's put some dates to my reconstructed timeline. The Clone Wars were declared in the year 22 BBY. Earlier in that year, Waylex Blissix delivered the Aethersprite. The genius designer immediately started planning a new generation of starfighter. Weeks later, clone acclimators were deployed to the Battle of Geonosis. As soon as the reports from Geonosis were processed, the shortcomings became clear. The Republic started the Victor Initiative project for a new wave of ships. I say Waylex Blissix left KDY for Rendirli in 21.83 BBY. This left his Alpha 3 Nimbus fighter unfinished. Lyra Blissix stayed to oversee the Kuat entry in the Victor Initiative. Drawing on existing KDY designs and shipyards, it was completed in record time. The first Venator-class Star Destroyer left port in the year 21 BBY. At the time, these characters held mostly V-19 Torrent starfighters. There were also a few Delta 7s for Jedi commanders, LA-80 gunships, and heavy walkers. Meanwhile, Waylex slowly continued his work for Rendirli. In the year 20.1 BBY, his greatest design was rushed into service. The Victory-class Star Destroyer appeared 6 months earlier than its planned launch date. This process took less than 2 years, but the deal had been for 2.5. The Victory class would set the template for all future Star Destroyers. In the meantime, Kuat Systems Engineering finished the V-Wing fighter. Republic Senar Systems had come up with the Actus, a replacement for the Delta 7. These two would be the primary ships aboard most Star Destroyers of the time. Incom and Subpro contributed an ARC 170 fighter to the fleet. Finally, Kuat Drive Yards had updated their classic Juggernaut for the war. The traditional model we all knew was the HAVW A5. This new HAVW A6 Juggernaut was associated with the Clone Wars. Lyra Blissix would propose an Imperator class to the Republic, but it was never accepted. This ship was a tough sell to the Empire and doesn't fit the Republic. It took years of scheming and a political marriage before Lyra Wessex got her dream ship. Now named the Imperial class, the project started around 16 BBY. No examples would enter service until 12 or 11 BBY. Both of the Republic's Star Destroyers are similar. The Venator is 1,137 meters long, making it one of the largest warships of its time. A Victory class is 900 meters long, just over half the length of an ISD. Partially, this size is dictated by their role. As an equivalent to the aircraft carrier, the Venator is highly specialized. A lot of internal volume is used for starfighter hangars, far more than for the Victory. In the Earth timeline, the Imperial Star Destroyer came first. This one carried 72 TIE fighters of various specializations. I don't need to recite the entire TIE series, assume any of them can be aboard ship. Beyond the fighter squadrons, there are many boats in an ISD hangar. Quite a few gunboats and blast boats, and 15 stormtrooper transports, 8 Lambda-class shuttles, and as many Gamma-class shuttles as needed. We'll save the Gamma-class for another time, because they are spectacular. What matters is that an ISD has a large hangar. The Victory is much smaller. It carries only 24 TIE fighters, 2 squadrons instead of 6. At least, it does in the standard configuration. That also includes a similar set of support vessels to the Imperial class. All manner of shuttles, troop transports, walkers, juggernauts. Like the hypothetical Acclamator carrier or infantry Venator, we could alter the cargo. There is potential for hundreds of TIEs or Republic V-Wings. The Venator can hold 192 Nimbus, 192 Actus, and 38 ARC 170s. That makes 3 ARC squadrons and 16 each of the one-man fighters. In terms of troop transport capacity, both Republic ships are identical. Victory and Venator each hold 2,000 troopers, a relatively low number. An Acclamator holds 16,000, and an Imperial has 9,700. The difference is in how those soldiers are deployed. Both Imperial ships, the ISD and VSD, use shuttles for this. In contrast, the Venator and Acclamator don't carry enough gunships. Acclamators have enough LAT-I capacity for 2,000 out of 16,000. Venators have 1,200 gunship seats for 2,000 troopers. That's because the Acclamator and Venator are capable of landing on a planet. They can just extend a ramp to unload their cargo. Not so for the Victory class or the Imperial Star Destroyer. One unique feature of the Victory is the atmospheric fins along its leading edges. These allow a Victory to operate in the upper atmosphere of a planet. Mighty strange. The Victory can fly, but it can't hover or get anywhere near the surface. Victories are one of the largest capital ships able to do this. Some smaller ones can't enter Atmo, like the Dreadnought and Interdictor. Almost no larger ships can, such as the MC-80 Moncal cruiser. The Imperial class, for example, is completely incapable of entering a planet's atmosphere. Well, they can fall out of orbit, but not fly or hover. If an ISD or Super Star Destroyer drops below orbit, it will impact the surface and break up. The same goes for any other large ship. A Lucahulk can only land its core on a planet. That's why we have shuttles and landing craft like the C-9979. This is a basic fact about sci-fi in general, and Star Wars is no exception. Capital ships are built in orbit, and they stay up there. Anytime you see a Star Destroyer hovering in mid-air, that is a mistake. However, it is possible for a large ship to be fitted with repulsor lifts. Cloud City demonstrates that fact, though it pays a heavy price. Quite literally, repulsor lifts are heavy, which means you need more repulsors to lift your repulsors. Much like with an oil rig, there is a huge space dedicated to flotation. In a ship like the Acclamator and Venator, a lot of machinery space is dedicated to repulsors and landing gear. That's part of why a Venator is larger than a Victory, because it's a landing barge. For larger ships, like the Imperial class or Super class, repulsors would be external. In the case of the Lusankya SSD, it was built in orbit like any other capital ship. Lusankya survived a controlled planetfall due to a custom-built repulsor cradle. That external repulsor lift module allowed Lucy to reach orbit again. Anyway, back to the Venator and the VSD. In terms of weaponry, the Venator is a mild improvement over its ancestor. A Venator has 8 DBY-827 heavy twin turbo laser turrets. These are arranged in a row of 4 on each side of the bridge. Years later, Kuat would use this heavy turbo laser placement for its Imperial class. There are also 2 medium dual turbo laser turrets in the forward notches. In the movie, we see an array of broadside deck guns. Their placement is hard to isolate, but the most likely area is along the equatorial trench. Like some of the batteries on the Death Star, these fired from inside through force field windows. The Venator deck guns seem to be higher caliber than the Death Star's anti-fighter cannons. As the last blaster weapon, the Venator has 52 point defense laser turrets. Any large ship ought to have a few of these. They're very practical, useful for shooting down torpedoes, starfighters, mines, or anything else. Most of the time, PDS cannons are not listed as weapons on a ship. Point defense does minimal damage to large ships. Carried over from the Acclamator, the Venator still has 4 torpedo tubes. Ammunition storage has been reduced, 64 proton torpedoes, down from 100. That leaves the Venator with 16 full salvos instead of 25. There is no mention of Venator launch tubes supporting missiles or a variety of payloads. Finally, the Venator has an array of tractor beams. As far as we know, this was a new addition. The Acclamator did not possess tractors. While I can't be sure of their placement, the Venator has 6 tractor beam projectors. For comparison, the Victory class has 10, and the Imperial class also has 10. This isn't a huge advantage for the VSD over the Venator, but it is one. Another aspect where the Victory is superior would be those launch tubes. Remember, the Venator has only 4 torpedo tubes. The Victory Star Destroyer has 80 concussion missile launchers. These are its main weapon for surface bombardment, and it will have multiple reloads. For that many tubes to be worthwhile, a VSD must hold hundreds or thousands of missiles. The Millennium Falcon destroyed the second Death Star with only 2 missiles. However, these ST-2 warheads are listed with a maximum range of 700 meters. For orbital bombardment, the VSD needs larger concussion missiles than you'd find on the Starfighter. We find a similar story with the main cannons of the Victory class. Remember, the Venator has a total of 10 double turbo laser turrets. As for the Victory, it has 40 double turbo lasers and 10 quad turbo lasers. Being a dedicated warship, a Victory is not weighed down by repulsor lifts and landing gear. Even with fighter support, a Venator has little chance of dueling a VSD. After the Clone Wars ended, a Victory 2 was developed. These sacrificed the missile launchers for a focus on space combat. The Victory 2 has 20 turbolaser batteries, 20 double turbolaser cannons, and 10 ion cannons. The Venator was already doomed against a Victory 1, so the Victory 2 is just unfair. Triumph in battle is one thing, but first you need to get there. Comparing the ships becomes slightly more fair when we look at the drive systems. Acclamator landing ships are some of the fastest we've seen, 0.6 past light speed. In hyperspace, the Venator has a Class 1 hyperdrive. That's still considered fast, just not unbelievably fast. It's a similar story for the sublight engines. An Acclamator could accelerate at 3,500 G. The Venator is listed at 3,000 G, which is still fast for a ship of its size. We don't have similar stats for the Victory class, but we don't need them. The Victory 1 uses Alderaanian LF9 sublight engines, and they are not sufficient. A Victory class is remarkably slow, meaning most ships can simply outrun them. All you need to do is evade the tractor beams, TIE fighters, and turbo lasers. We can assume Walex Blissex intended to fix this deficiency, if he had time. Since the VSD was rushed into service, its original form kept the slow sublight engines. The Victory 2 refit solved this by replacing the LF9s with Horsch-Kessel ion drives. Hyperspace performance was not affected by the refit project. Like the Venator, both versions of the VSD had Class 1.0 hyperdrives. That makes them twice as fast as an Imperial Star Destroyer. An Imperial 1 has only a Class 2 hyperdrive, the same as a Super Star Destroyer. The Empire couldn't recreate that speed until the Imperial 2, which had a Class 1 hyperdrive. In conclusion, each ship has its own role to play. If you need to land an army of soldiers, the Acclamator cannot be beaten. For carrying short-range starfighters, a Venator would be the optimal choice. When you need an orbital bombardment or support for ground forces, the Victory 1 is ideal. If all you want is a space dragster, the Acclamator is surprisingly suitable. Any of them could do well in a space battle, but not equally. Venator beats Acclamator, and Victory beats Venator. All three can enter the atmosphere of a planet, but the victory stops there. Only the Acclimator and Venator are capable of landing or hovering. Trying that with an Imperial Star Destroyer just gets you a new shipwreck. There are two ways to support us. Become a patron at patreon.com/thebreadcircus, or subscribe, like, and comment. Only the former option guarantees that your name lives on in history. The other is embarrassing YouTube-y stuff.
What, you think you're some kind of Jedi waving your hand around like that? I'm a Toydarian. My tricks don't work on me. Only money. No money, no parts, no deal.